AP 120, Lab 11, topics heart and blood pressure. So here is the heart in cartoon form. What three cavities is the heart found in? I hope you came up with thoracic cavity, pericardial cavity, and mediastinum. So the heart has four chambers: the right atrium, the right ventricle forming the right pump, and the left atrium and left ventricle forming the left pump. Each atria has associated with it a little extra flap of tissue called the auricle. So you have the auricle for the right atrium, the auricle for the left atrium. They increase the volume of the atria, and they look kind of like dog ears to some scientists, so that's why they're called auricles. The point of the heart is referred to as the apex, so that would be the apex of the heart. There's a wall between the ventricles referred to as the interventricular septum. Left ventricle, right ventricle, interventricular septum. And there are blood vessels that travel carrying blood to or away from the heart. We have the superior vena cava, which is a vein carrying blood to the right atrium. The inferior vena cava, also a vein carrying blood to the right atrium, also the coronary sinus. And then we have the pulmonary trunk, which is an artery carrying blood to the right and left pulmonary arteries that then go to the lungs. And then, of course, we have the pulmonary veins, right and left pulmonary veins carrying blood to the left atrium. And then, of course, the aorta carrying blood to the entire body. And the aorta is an artery, and the pulmonary trunk is an artery. And yet they're different colors. Reason for that is the color red represents a vessel carrying oxygenated blood. The color blue represents a vessel carrying deoxygenated blood. So veins can be red and arteries can be blue for the pulmonary circuit anyway. All right. There are four valves. There's the tricuspid valve between the right atria and ventricle. We have the pulmonary valve between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. We have the bicuspid valve, also known as mitral valve, between the left atrium and left ventricle. And then you can barely see it here, the aortic valve between the left ventricle and the aorta. The pulmonary valve and aortic valve are semilunar valves, which means they have these three little pockets that look to somebody kind of like a crescent moon. And they are at the border between the heart's ventricles and the arteries coming off of those ventricles. And when blood backflows, these pockets will fill with blood, closing the valves, preventing blood from backing up into the ventricles. Then we have the atrioventricular valves, the tricuspid valve and bicuspid valve. Tricuspid valve has three little leaflets or cusps. The bicuspid valve has two little leaflets or cusps. And the leaflets are attached to the papillary muscles on the walls of the ventricles via these string-like structures called the chordae tendineae. So the chordae tendineae, tendinous structures connecting the leaflets or cusps of the valves to the papillary muscles on the walls of the ventricles. And these are important. The chordae tendineae are important because they prevent the valves from inverting. So the valves, when the pressure builds in the ventricles, will close but not invert, thereby preventing blood from backing up into the atria. All right, when you look at the walls of the heart, you see that there are three layers to the heart wall. You have the superficial epicardium on the surface of the heart, the various tissues on the surface, including adipose tissue. We have the myocardium, which is the middle layer, the thickest layer, made up of cardiac muscle tissue. And then we have the very thin endocardium lining the inside of the chambers of the heart, and there to be nice and smooth and reduce friction. All right, papillary muscles are they found in the atria, in the ventricles, attached to coronary tendineae, both 1 and 3, or both 2 and 3? Correct answer is both 2 and 3. They are in the ventricles. Here they are in the ventricles, and they're attached to coronary tendineae, attached to the heartstrings. All right, so we have systemic and pulmonary circulation. Pulmonary circulation carrying deoxygenated blood to the lungs to get oxygenated, and systemic circuit carrying oxygenated blood to the tissues of the body to carry the oxygen to the tissues and then carry carbon dioxide back to the heart. Systemic and pulmonary circulation. We also have some blood vessels that carry blood to the heart itself. So this starts off with the right and left coronary arteries carrying oxygenated blood, nutrient-rich blood to the heart itself. And then it ends with the coronary sinus, which is a vein, which returns blood, deoxygenated blood, into the right atrium. And blood pressure. Well, blood pressure is the force the blood exerts on the vessel's wall. Blood pressure is usually measured at the brachial artery, so in the artery in the brachial region of the arm, the upper arm as it were. The systolic pressure is the blood pressure during ventricular systole. So this is the higher number when the ventricles are contracting, are forcing blood into the arteries. And then diastolic pressure. Diastolic pressure is the lower number for blood pressure, and this is the blood pressure during ventricular diastole. So when the ventricles are relaxed, the heart is relaxed, this is the blood pressure in the arteries that remains. Normal value, normal max value for a young adult is 120/80 milligrams of mercury, so 120/80. 120 for systolic pressure, 80 for diastolic pressure. But there's a range that's good for people, and it varies by age. Blood pressure is important because this is measuring stress on small arteries. And of course, if your blood pressure is chronically too high, this will stress those arteries and potentially lead to rupturing of arteries. Again, here's this lovely image. Atrial systole, ventricular systole, diastole, atrial systole, ventricular systole, diastole, contracting and relaxing of the heart. Hypertension is when your chronic resting blood pressure is above 140 for your systolic number and or above 90 for your diastolic number. To be honest, I think these numbers have changed, have lowered in terms of what's now considered high blood pressure. But again, chronic, so it occurs frequently when you are at rest. So chronic blood pressure, common blood pressure when you are at rest, 140 and or 90. And the blood hypertension is bad because it destroys arterioles, the microscopic arteries, which then affects the ability of blood to continue through the blood system. It can damage kidneys. Kidneys have very fragile capillaries that when ruptured causes the kidneys to stop functioning. It can damage the heart because it's making the heart work harder and exhausting the heart. It can also damage the small blood vessels within the heart. It can cause blindness because the retina in the eye is very delicate and has many blood vessels that if the blood pressure is too high can damage the retina. It can lead to heart attacks from overworking the heart and from, say, rupturing of a blood vessel in the heart. And it can cause an aneurysm. And an aneurysm is when an artery becomes damaged and then permanently widened in an area. So it's a bulging artery. And aneurysms can be painful, and aneurysms are sites where it is more common, more possible for that artery to rupture, often killing the person because aneurysms are usually in major, more important arteries. And remember, that is hypertension, high systolic and or high diastolic pressure. All right, so as the blood travels through the arteries, through the capillaries, and into the veins, blood pressure goes down. So we can clearly see that. And then blood pressure at its peak is the systolic blood pressure, and blood pressure at its lowest trough is the diastolic blood pressure. Ventricles contracted, ventricles relaxed, ventricles contracted, ventricles relaxed. Boop doop, important numbers. And that is it for Lab 11's lecture.